Hey, and thanks to all of you who've tuned in to my page for this second legislative update on Facebook Live. Busy day here in Washington, D.C. We just passed the omnibus bill out of the Senate. The House had passed that yesterday. The House has been busy all day long. They just moved out their health care plan. But what I'd like to talk to today is about where we are with the FY17 funding, as well as kind of talk about perhaps the forecast for FY18 that the Trump administration has laid down in this, quote, skinny budget. So we did this Facebook Live a couple weeks ago. Many of you probably know that you can leave comments right here on the video. So if you've got questions related to the omnibus appropriations bill that we just passed, or funding the government down the road for FY18 that you'd like me to answer, just type your questions in the comments section, and I'm going to try to get through as many as I can in the next half of an hour. And if you can't watch the whole update in real time, know that the video will be archived on my Facebook page. So bear with me as we work through this technology. I appreciate it. I wanted to quickly explain the differences between the two funding measures that we're talking about today, because I think sometimes they can be confusing. The first is the omnibus bill that has just passed the House, passed the Senate today by a vote of 79 to 18, and this funds the federal government through the end of September, the balance of this fiscal year. This is different than President Trump's skinny budget proposal outline. You probably read about this in the news back in March. And then to make things even a little more confusing, Congress is expected to receive the president's full budget request for FY18 sometime this month, probably in another couple weeks. But to put it simply, what we saw was the president laid down a marker in March, and then he's going to give us a more detailed budget request then in a couple weeks. And then once we receive that, we get back to work on taking the request under consideration. But really, the president can propose and then, as we say around here, we dispose. It's up to the Congress to determine what programs to fund and at what levels. I've heard from a lot of Alaskans over the past couple months who are concerned about some of the proposals that they have heard through the news. And so that's why I wanted to hear directly from you about what programs and what services you want to see funded in FY18. Now, back to the omnibus that passed both houses. First and foremost, I think we do the responsible thing by funding the government. We prevented a government shutdown. I am of the belief that a shutdown is never warranted, and this bill avoids that from happening. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, and I'm chairman of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, I had a significant hand in including provisions that are important to our state. That includes things like funding of payment in lieu of taxes, PILT, for land in Alaska that's owned by the federal government. Other programs like the State Revolving Fund, Alaska Native Village programs that support basic water and sanitation infrastructure, particularly in rural Alaska. Support for EPA airshed grants, helping communities like Fairbanks. We also prioritize national security. And I think if you look at the current instability in Russia and North Korea, Russia certainly is in the news, and North Korea as well. There has never been a more important time to invest in our Pacific and our Arctic defense. The bill provides funds for the procurement of F-35s, long-range discrimination radar there at Clear, funds for the ground-based missile defense at Fort Greely, and something I know that Alaskans are keen to hear about, it does provide funds for the procurement and construction of an icebreaker. It facilitates a land exchange in Southeast Alaska that addresses environmental concerns by protecting community viewsheds, trails, recreational lands, and tourism. And it provides critical timber to keep our local sawmills running, while all at the same time raising funds for mental health programs for the most vulnerable in our state. We provide support for essential air service. We know that this is a critical lifeline for many of our rural communities. It also provides considerable support for the fight against opioid abuse, this epidemic that is plaguing our cities, our villages, and across the nation. There's a lot in this bill, but rather than me going through a laundry list, I would encourage you to stay tuned to my Facebook page over the next couple days as we list out more of the provisions of this bill in detail. So now I'm going to turn it over to you to ask me some questions about where we are right now with the omnibus just having passed the House yesterday and now the Senate, and where we go from here. So Karina, you're in charge of whatever questions are coming in on Facebook there.
Everyone, this is Karina Peterson with Senator Murkowski's office. I'm going to be moderating this for you all. So, Senator, before we jump into what we're here to talk about today, funding the government and the omnibus, we're getting a lot of questions about the House health care bill that just passed.
Right.
So this comes from Darrell Lewis and several others. What's your position on the House Health Care Act that just passed the House?
Well, the House has been working to find the votes to pass a health care bill. It's been a bit of a moving target, and I think that is probably an understatement. There are particulars of the bill that I am not perhaps as well informed as others on, and I accept that because we weren't quite sure what the House was going to be able to do to garner the votes that they needed. I will tell you, you will see the Senate write its own bill. It may be that we will take pieces and aspects of the House bill. I can't tell you what or if, but I think it is fair to say that ball is now in the court of the Senate. We will take this very seriously, very responsibly. I have been one that has said all along there are some priorities. I think we recognize that there were some good things that came out of the ACA, some things that I want to figure out how we maintain, whether it's ensuring that those with pre-existing conditions continue to stay covered, those under 26 stay on their policies, Medicaid expansion, making sure that those benefits that have been made available to some 30,000 Alaskans, that they're able to be continued, particularly as we're seeing how we're able to utilize some of those Medicaid funds to help those with addictions, behavioral health, providing them services that they may have never had ever. So again, it's about access. It's about reducing our costs in a state where our costs are higher than anybody else's out there, and making sure that we don't pull the rug out from underneath. We know that right now the Affordable Care Act and the individual market itself is not on a sustainable path right now. And we know that we have to address these concerns. But I think what you will see is the Senate taking a measured approach to how we address this issue of health care and health care reform. So stay tuned.
Okay, thank you, Senator. The next question is from Morgan Lim. Hello, Senator Murkowski, writing from Fairbanks. You asked which programs we would like to see funded. I would ask that you ensure that Medicaid remains funded and that those on Medicaid and Title X can continue to seek care at Planned Parenthood. Can you please comment on this?
Sure. Kind of dovetails to the response that I just gave on where the Senate may take healthcare reform. Again, I feel very strongly that the benefits that we have seen in Alaska with Medicaid expansion are allowed to continue. I have been a strong proponent of making sure that when it comes to providing for healthcare services for Alaskans all over the state, making sure that that dollars that continue through Title X are made available, making sure that services for women are not further limited, but that they are expanded and those opportunities are allowed to continue. I think it is important to note that in this FY17 omnibus that we just moved out, that funding for Planned Parenthood is retained. I think that was important, and I want to make sure that, again, whether it is Planned Parenthood funding or whether it is funding through Title X, that those services for women and our families are not only able to continue but are not restricted.
Okay, thank you, Senator. This next question is from Christine Rodriguez. How can we continue to invest in Alaska's future with such cuts to education and health care for our citizens?
Well, I think it's important to look and keep in mind, we're having this discussion on Facebook today in the context of where we are right now with the 17 budget that we have just passed. I think it is important to recognize that we've got good measures in this appropriations omnibus that relate to education and education funding, whether it is allowing for those provisions that we've laid down in ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, or making sure that there are funds for Alaska Native education equity programs, our tribally run colleges. So I'm really very comfortable with what we have seen with this fiscal year and how we have provided for education. Healthcare, I mentioned in my opening comments, the considerable plus up that we have in this appropriations omnibus related specifically to opioid addiction. We do much more with regards to mental health. We have provisions in here that continue the Zero Suicide Initiative, so focus on suicide, domestic violence programs, mental health issues. I think we have done well in these categories. Funding for NIH is increased. So I know that there is a lot of concern because there have been comments that have come out that in this next budget we might see further reductions in, say, in aspects of healthcare. We're going to keep an eye on that. That's what we're going to be doing really beginning tomorrow when we start work on the 2018 budget. But making sure that what we're doing here is we're balancing priorities. Does education have to be a priority for this nation? Absolutely. Does healthcare have to be a priority? Absolutely. Do we need to maintain our nation's national security and provide for a robust defense? Absolutely. So how we work through these priorities, this is the job of your men and women in Congress.
Thank you, Senator. The next question is from Jen Joliffe. Given that Alaska is going to be significantly affected by warming temperatures, what are your plans on funding for climate change?
Well, there's no one line item for climate change in any budget, and of course you wouldn't expect that, but making sure that we're doing right by our oceans, making sure that we are investing in the research and the science and the data that comes with understanding what is going on as a consequence of a changing climate. These are all important categories. So that was one of the priorities that I had when I was looking at the commerce aspects of the budget and making sure that funding for NOAA, funding for data and research for our fisheries remains strong. Making sure that on the EPA side we are providing for funding to allow for the real mission of EPA, which is ensuring clean air, clean water. So making sure that we are addressing the issues of our environment, that we are understanding our science, but in order to understand our science, we've got to be able to gather it, we've got to be able to provide for that level of research. So as we deal with issues as they relate to a changing climate, it's understanding what's happening, and it is providing resources in the appropriate areas. I think it's also important to note that we see the impact of climate change in Alaska. We see it on our infrastructure. So as we discuss ways to deal with infrastructure needs around the country, there are Alaska priorities, whether it is providing for coastal erosion plans, working with the Corps, or other infrastructure that will help us reduce some of the imminent threat that perhaps our coastal communities or our river communities are facing. These have to continue to be priorities.
Okay, Senator, next question is from Jeff Sires. Senator, I live and work as an environmental scientist in Soldotna. While there are numerous federal agencies and programs facing cuts, my question pertains to the EPA, which could be very well gutted to the point of being obsolete. Severe funding restrictions coupled with direction from an administrator that rejects scientific fact will prevent long-term protections of the ecosystems, landscapes, and natural resources that truly make Alaska unique and valuable. How will you ensure that our world-famous fisheries, wildlife, rivers, forests, mountains, and glaciers receive the social and economic support that they desperately need?
Well, I think where he's going with his question is the EPA going to continue to be able to effect its mission, which is clean air, clean water, ultimately. And I think that is an important mission and one that needs to be resourced appropriately. I'm chairman of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee that has oversight of the EPA, so that's effectively the budget that we review and we look critically at to ensure that they are able to effectuate that mission. Now, I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of people in Alaska and around the country that I hear from that say, you know, EPA is just kind of gets in the way, you should not fund EPA. Well, we need to have the EPA. The EPA is an agency, again, with an important mission to ensure that we are putting in place the safeguards that will provide for clean air, clean water, and what we in Alaska enthusiastically embrace with the amazing resources that we have. So how we work together to find that balance is key. What I have been looking at specifically within EPA is how we can really target those programs where we know we're making a difference. For instance, let's take Fairbanks. They've just been designated, they are in serious non-attainment because of particulate matter that comes in the wintertime where the inversions keep emissions that come from vehicles that are kept running in these cold winter months locked in, causing very poor air quality. It needs to be addressed. It has to be addressed. EPA is coming in with enforcement measures, but they recognize that Fairbanks is left with few alternatives to keep warm. What's happening is more and more families are choosing to heat their homes with wood stoves to just stay warm because their fuel bills are so high, which causes greater emissions. So one of the things that we have looked particularly to is making sure that these airshed grants from EPA are continued so that communities like Fairbanks can gain some assistance, whether it's a wood stove change-out program or whatever it is that works for that community. So working with the communities, the states, and the federal agencies to make sure that, again, clean air, clean water, allowing us to live in the amazing place that we call home. So we need to be working with our EPA while at the same time recognizing that the EPA works within its jurisdiction and not pushing out beyond that jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Just a reminder for everyone that you can ask questions by writing something in the comment section right under the Facebook Live. This next question comes from Brenna Litzenberger from Soldotna. Are there any line items that support alternative energy growth in Alaska?
Well, in the energy and water piece, we do have programs within DOE that help to facilitate the expansion of alternative energy. We have continued funding for RPE, which is kind of the technology aspect. Certainly within programs, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my mind if there's any specific ones that benefit us more targeted in Alaska. We've been working on provisions that will help move out microgrid opportunities and technologies that can help, particularly in our small communities where it is piecing together different alternative sources of energy that will be important. We do have a provision in the bill that relates to the carbon neutrality of biomass, effectively directing the Secretary of Energy, Agriculture, and I believe it must be Interior to come together to lay down a policy that expresses that biomass is a renewable energy source, a carbon neutral energy source, so that it can, being labeled a green energy source, it allows for opportunity to perhaps create more market opportunities for biomass. And so for us in a state like Alaska, you've got certain areas, whether you're down in southeast where you have wood chips and the opportunity for pellets. You certainly have that up in the interior area. Willow operations where you could create biomass. So we've got some opportunities there as well, but that's a very specific example of one of the things that we do to help with alternatives and renewables.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Next question is from Cheryl Church. If they open up the Arctic waters for drilling there has to be adequate resources to respond to an oil spill. Mm-hmm. Will we have icebreakers and Coast Guards stationed up north?
Well, icebreakers is an issue that I've been working on for a long time. I think many Alaskans have heard that we are woefully underprepared, in my view, when it comes to icebreaking capacity. We have one older icebreaker. She's on detail to Antarctica. Probably won't see Arctic waters for the duration of her useful years. We have the Healy, which is a medium strength. We see her in and out of Alaska relatively frequently. Very capable vessel, but again, medium strength, and there's only one. So we have included resourcing in this bill for an icebreaker, $150 million for procurement through DoD, through the Department of Defense, as well as $55 million in Coast Guard side of the budget. We recognize that in this country, as an Arctic nation, having one icebreaker is simply not sufficient. And so getting moving on that is important. Making sure that the Coast Guard has sufficient resources is also equally important. We've contained in this omnibus funding to do the further build out of OPCs. These are the offshore patrol cutters, as well as some of the other cutters that you will see in and around the state. Ketchikan is receiving 2 of them. They just commissioned the first one about a month ago, and then there will be additional cutters coming to the state of Alaska. Remember, the waters around our state are pretty tough, and some of the vessels that the Coast Guard is currently using go back to the early 70s. So it is important that we make sure that not only for future development relating to oil and gas opportunities up in the Beaufort or the Chukchi, but for fisheries enforcement, for drug interdiction, for search and rescue, we need to have our Coast Guard there. We need to have the resourcing there, and we're getting a start finally on the icebreakers, but it's been a long time in coming, and I've been dogged on this, and I'm going to keep up until not only we get the first one built, but we've got a series of them coming on.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Next question is from Lauren Scar. I would like to know more about what funding measures were in the budget that would help Alaska address its opioid crisis.
It's a great question, and I appreciate it. There is. I can't even hardly turn because of this wire in my ear. But I think it's important to realize in the many areas where we actually address the opioid issue. We have funding to assist with the VA in their programs. We have funding through SAMHSA. We have, I want to get some specific numbers here for you, so I'm kind of wandering through my hang on just one second. I got so much good stuff here that here we go. There's 500 million that is in 21st century cures, and this includes new state response to the opioid abuse program. So that's 500 million there. You've got an additional 56 million for medication-assisted treatment programs. There is an additional 20 million for programs that are authorized in CARA, and this includes funding for improving access to overdose treatment, 12 million for first responder training. There is treatment, again, for prescription drug overdose and heroin abuse programs through CDC. There's additional funding through HRSA, which is the Health Resources and Services Administration, not less than $50 million. And this is in addition to $94 million in mandatory funds awarded for the substance abuse grants. And then again, as I mentioned, additional support for the VA to combat heroin and opioid abuse. That comes in at $50 million. Different Department of Justice grants, funding also directed to the Bureau of Prisons, funding also directed to Drug Enforcement Administration. And Lauren, I'd ask you to keep looking at our Facebook page, because as we, over these next couple of days, we're going to be taking a few of these high priority issues where people are really focused on them and detailing the specifics. So all those numbers that I just rattled off to you, you'll have them in a much more coherent fashion. But I think it's important to rattle those off, because it's important that we understand that there is a commitment to dealing with this opioid scourge. It is an epidemic. It's a crisis. We're using words that are pretty intense, and rightfully so, because what we are seeing around the country with the levels of addiction and the grief and the sadness that is attached not only to those who are addicted but to their families and their communities is something that demands an all-hands response. And so there's a lot of effort that is being directed by this Congress, and it's very important that we're doing so.
Okay, thank you, Senator. We have time for one more question.
Okay.
This is from Travis McClendon. What are your thoughts on the proposed cuts to programs such as the National Park Service and National Forest Service, especially in a state like Alaska with vast amounts of federally protected natural resources? And I forgot to mention, Travis is from Anchorage.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, Travis, once again, I'm going to look to my numbers, but we actually did pretty well when it comes to our National Park Service and how we supported funding within our parks. As you may know, this is the centennial of our parks. It was important to make sure that we are addressing the maintenance and backlog within our parks. And so we, in fact, have an increase, and I don't have the right paper, Travis, but I'll get you exactly the amount of the increase in Park Service, because I think that is important to recognize. We have an obligation. We've got amazing public lands. We certainly appreciate them in the state of Alaska, but we also have a responsibility to care for those public lands. And so whether it is ensuring that the road into Denali is safe, for those who transit it or the buses that take the tourists in. This is part of the ongoing maintenance of maintaining these public lands. So ensuring that not only the lands are appropriately resourced, but that the men and women who work for our parks, who work for the Forest Service, who work for our other federal agencies in caring for our public lands are addressed. This has been a priority, and again, I think particularly in Alaska, with a large number of national park land and public land that we have, I think this year's budget is a good and a responsible balancing of how we provide for that support.
Okay, thank you. And that's all. But Senator, if you want to just, do you have any last final thoughts?
Well, again, I think it's good to have this conversation about what we have just moved through the Congress. But keep in mind, this is funding for the next 5 months. This takes us through September. Beyond that, we've got fiscal year 18 that we need to do. It is my hope that what you will see for this next fiscal year is an appropriations process that allows us to take up the 12 individual appropriations bills, move them individually across the floor with an amendment process, allowing for the full-on back and forth that goes with building good legislation, good spending bills. And so to avoid an omnibus at the end of the year, avoid a continuing resolution at the end of the year, but a process that, again, allows for us to have good, constructive debate about how we meet our nation's needs and our priorities when it comes to whether it's infrastructure or programs or wildfires. How we build this in an open and a responsive way is important to us. My hope is that we will see a good process this year, and one that demonstrates that we are being responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollars while still meeting the priorities and needs of Alaskans and people around the country. So thanks for tuning in. We'll do another one of these. Let us know if you've got any suggestions on the topics that you would like us to cover. We've done healthcare, now the budget, and maybe the next one is infrastructure or tax reform. So give us your comments there. Thank you, and appreciate this back and forth here. Take care.